familiar with this life form?
Yes. My people encountered them a century ago. They destroyed our cities. Scattered my people throughout the galaxy. They're called the Borg. Protect yourself, Captain, or they'll destroy you.
What if the Borg weren't a natural threat? What if they were a weapon? One designed not to conquer, but to silence. Not by a machine, but by a god. The El-Aurians were known as listeners, but that title is almost too soft. They were empaths, seers, beings that didn't just listen to people, they listened to time. They felt the flow of reality, the rhythm of causality, the distortions that came when something or someone pushed the universe out of alignment. In yesterday's Enterprise, Guinan doesn't know why reality feels wrong, she just knows.
Ensign Thomas, please report to Combat Information Center. Ensign Thomas to CIC.
This isn't right. It's changed.
That's not intuition, that's temporal perception. And it made her people one thing above all others: witnesses. And for the Q, that made them dangerous. The Q thrive on chaos, on doing the unexpected. They exist beyond cause and effect. But the El-Aurians, they understood the game. They didn't interfere, they didn't fight, at least that we know of. But they could see, and they remembered. That alone was a threat. Imagine being an omnipotent entity, but every time you tried to nudge a timeline or alter an event, someone noticed. Someone remembered what it was before. To Q, that wasn't just inconvenient, it was a problem that had to be solved. You cannot outplay a species that sees your every move. So Q changed the board. The Q didn't create the Borg from nothing. They probably found a civilization, advanced, curious, already integrating technology with flesh, and gave them a push. No time travels, no flash of divine light, just influence. Enough to nudge them down a darker path, one without individuality, without empathy. The Q didn't need to intervene directly, because the El-Aurians weren't watching them. They were watching the sky, the timelines, the divine. They didn't see the shadow growing in the dark. The Borg weren't gods, they were invisible to the El-Aurians, and that made them the perfect weapon. The Borg came, the El-Aurians fell, their civilization shattered. Refugees scattered across the galaxy. In generations, Guinan is rescued from one of the two ships carrying El-Aurian survivors when the Borg destroyed their homeworld, or at least were attempting to flee in some way. But some of them didn't just die, they were pulled into the Nexus. And here, the theory deepens. What if the Nexus wasn't just a ribbon of cosmic joy? What if it was a containment field, a cloaking device, a prison designed to remove the most perceptive El-Aurians from the timeline? Guinan escaped, but even then, something was taken. In Q Who, Picard asks if she knows Q. She simply says, or at least infers, that they had dealings. She knows what he is, but really doesn't explain. So here's a question. Did Q attempt to erase her memory, or at least erase the memory of all El-Aurians? If so, they failed. On that topic, let's zoom out for a second. The El-Aurians existed during a time of, well, warfare that involved time. A Cold War across centuries, with factions vying to manipulate the past for control of the future. But the El-Aurians didn't fight in it, at least that we know of. They disrupted it just by existing. Their perception made major alterations risky. If the El-Aurians noticed timeline changes, they could expose entire operations with a single whisper. That made them a liability. To everyone. Maybe Q wasn't the only one who wanted them gone, wanted them removed from the game. Maybe the Borg were more than a divine weapon. They were a convenient solution. And this solution succeeded, at first. The El-Aurians were broken, their history scattered. Their role as witnesses, erased. But Q, like they do sometimes, miscalculated. The Borg didn't stop with the El-Aurians. They grew, they adapted, and they began assimilating knowledge far beyond what the Q anticipated.
By whose calculations?
You judge yourselves against the pitiful adversaries you've encountered so far. The Romulans, the Klingons. They're nothing compared to what's waiting.
including echoes of the very race he tried to silence. When Q said, "You're not prepared," that wasn't just a lesson. That was panic. Q wasn't testing Picard. He was warning him. If I'm right, then the Q couldn't destroy the Borg. Not anymore. They had grown too large, too resilient, and worst of all, they were still spreading. So Q chose humanity. He threw the Enterprise at the Borg far earlier than they should have encountered them. He pushed them to evolve, to survive, and to win. Not because humanity was special, but because the Q had run out of options. And the irony, the Federation would clean up the Q's mess, and never even realize it. So why would Q go to such lengths? Why destroy a peaceful race of listeners? Why silence the only beings who didn't fight, only watched? Because sometimes power isn't challenged by force, it's challenged by truth. The El-Aurians were a mirror, and gods hate mirrors. The Borg were never the real story, they were the cover story. Ultimately, Guinan lives. Not as a warrior, not as a god, but as something far more terrifying to beings like Q, a survivor. She's part of a hidden El-Aurian remnant, a dying race, a fading voice of memory still listening. The Federation stopped the Borg, but they never knew who built them, or why. The El-Aurians listened, they remembered, and the Q never forgave them for it.